Horses sleep standing up. And there's people walking around totally somnambulant. And a lot of people learn through perfunctory existence to go on to automatic pilot. You see it all the time. A lot of people check out. That's what television is. Television is checking out. All these distractive modes that we use to distract ourselves from the real work, which is waking up. And that's very difficult to do, to wake up. It's a challenge from Allah. And that's why الناس نيام, people are asleep. وَإِذَا مَاتُوا انْتَبَهُوا, but when they die, they suddenly come to attention. It doesn't say they wake up. And that's what that thing is. Most people they're not attentive. They're in that state of, they're awake, but they're in ghafla. That's what Allah calls it. He calls it ghafla, which is not sleep, it's distraction. They're distracted. So we're in this state of distraction. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Now, you will almost always find in the Quran, see, this began, how did it begin before this? لَهُ حَمْدُ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And then it goes into pairs, right, human beings. And then right after that, Allah, وَمِنْ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And this is constantly present in when Allah speaks about the self. And He speaks about heavens and earth, and then He speaks about humans. And this is what Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, he said, that you think that you're some insignificant creature, and you don't see that the heavens and the earth are in fact wrapped up in you. That you're a microcosm of the world. And that's why if you know yourself, you know the world. If you know yourself, you know the world. And if you know yourself, you know the creator of the world. Because He is known through His creation. And the closest thing to you is yourself. It's closer than anything else. And that's why dragons are really interesting. Because dragons show up in a lot of cultures. And the Chinese have a lot of dragon in their culture. And where do dragons come from? Because in the depths of the self, there are these dragons. They call them tinnin in Arabic. Tinnin. And in the depths of the ocean, we don't even know what's down there. They haven't even seen a giant squid. Right? I mean, it's all theory about what giant squids are actually like. There have been reports of sailors, but it's all anecdotal. On the whale's body, they find these massive tentacles on these dead whales. And they know that they're down there, but nobody's actually seen one. So there's things down there in the self, right? In the depths of the soul. A lot of dark stuff, and then there's light stuff as well. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. And then from His signs are the heavens and the earth, the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your tongues and your colors. Which is another really interesting thing, because one of the meanings of that is the distinctive nature of color and tongue. If you look at people, one of the ways we distinguish each other is through color and tone of voice. If you know somebody, when they call you on the phone, it's almost instantaneous that you recognize their voice. How is it that Allah has given every single human being a distinct voice? I mean, that's one of the things Allah is saying, that from the distinctions of your voices is a sign. Here's a blueprint, and they can even do, they have sophisticated computers where if they record your voice, they can get an exact, and they'll pick, that's how they caught that drug dealer down in South America. He just talked on his cell phone for a minute or something, and one of these computers picked him up in Langley. They had him caught just from the voice. How is it that Allah has made human voices so distinct, and yet the spectrum that we speak in is very limited? The scale's not, I mean, we can go very deep, bass, and we can go to alto. There's a spectrum, but the average voices are actually in a very small corridor of vibration. And yet, there's 6 billion people walking around the earth with distinct voices. And then color, because if you look at people, like just looking in this room, if you look around, you'll notice everybody has a distinct complexion. Even if they're from the same race, they have distinct complexions. That's another sign of Allah. And that's why the idea of becoming enemies because of these differences, that's what Allah is saying, is these are signs of God. These aren't reasons to have animosity. These are reasons to say, Subhanallah, He made you. That's extraordinary. I mean, when I first went into the desert in the Sahara, there were people that had never seen skin as white as mine. Children, they would just, they were really shocked to see that. And children don't know racism. That is a learned experience. They really do learn it. And who introduces it is those demonic elements in the world. But once it's introduced, it becomes what, they call a meme now. It becomes like a gene of the mind. And it infects people. So you get infected with it. It's a disease. But if you raise a child, they won't have that. It's something that you teach. It's taught. And it comes from vileness. Because that's the thing. If you go down the dark corridors of the soul gets darker and darker, and you become a demonic character. And we believe in shayatinul ins, that there are demons from amongst human beings, and they're worse than the demonic realm of the unseen. They're actually worse, according to Ibn Abbas. So this idea of the diversity of your tongues and your colors, وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. Now, what is the relationship between the heavens and the earth and your tongues and your colors? Again, the relationship here is what is from heaven is language, and what is from earth is color. And the thing about the human being is that we are an inner space between heaven and earth. If you look at the hierarchy of being, we have the elemental nature, which is our turab, the dirt, that we are dirt. But then we have the angelic, celestial. So we've got terrestrial and celestial qualities that are merged in our nature. They're intermingled, right? This is the yarn of human existence. It's this mingled yarn. And it's celestial and terrestrial. And so the language, the word in Arabic for what we were taught by God in the Quran, when God says, Allama Adam al-asma, He taught Adam the asma. And the Jews and the Christians believe that as well. That what Adam was given was, alayhi salam, were the names. And the word in Arabic, ism, is from sama. Because it's what is sama, yismu. It's what's high. So the language, that's what we were taught in the heavens. We were taught language. But the stuff that we were made of was of the earth. And that's why there's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said that Adam was made from all the earth of the world. From the white clay, from the yellow clay, from the brown clay, from the red clay, and from the black clay. And that's why Adam, alayhi salam, who was tawny, udma means dark, and Hawa means black in Arabic. That the first people were dark, and from all of that comes all these recessive genes, which is why light skin is a recessive gene. But it's in there. So the whole spectrum of color that you see in the world is from this creation of the earth. That's part of it. The differences of the language, because Allah is glorified in an untold number of languages. So all of this comes together in human beings. And this is what's so extraordinary about the human being. And then Allah says, Inna fi dhalika la'ayatin lil'alimin, and in Warsh He says lil'alamin, that this is a sign for the alimin, which are people who know, and the alamin, which are the worlds. This is a sign. And then He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِ مَنَامُكُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ وَابْتِغَاؤُكُمْ مِنْ فَضْلِ. And from amongst His signs is your sleep during the day and the night. And ibtiga'ukum min fadlihi, and that you seek His bounty. And the reason Allah says that is to remind you that your provision is from His fadl. It's not from your seeking. Ibtiga'ukum min fadlihi. You just have to go out and seek. But what you find is from His bounty. So it doesn't lead to that delusional state, because you can seek all you want and never get anything. And then another person does very little and he gets plenty. And part of that, the scholar said that the reason for that, the diversity of livelihood, that some of the most clever people are impoverished and some of the most simple people are enriched in the world. So it's not about intellect. It's about provision, where it comes from. وَفِي السَّمَاءِ رِزْقُكُمْ. In the heavens is your provision. That's where it came from. وَفِي السَّمَاءِ رِزْقُكُمْ وَمَا تُوعَدُونَ. And what you're promised. It's guaranteed. So don't worry about it. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَسْمَعُونَ. And this is a sign for people who listen. People who are attentive, right? It's related to being inattentive. I mean, some of the scholars say manamukum bil-layli wan-nahar means the time you sleep in the day, time you sleep. That's the outward meaning. But there are some of the scholars use it to indicate this idea of the inattentiveness of people in the world, that it's almost like they're asleep. So, I mean, that's a secondary, it's called the ishara. So, but the primary one is that other meaning. So that's important to distinguish. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ يُرِيكُمُ الْبَرْقَ خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا. And from among His signs is lightning. He shows it to you out of fear and hope. وَيُنَزِّلُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً فَيُحْيِي بِهِ الْأَرْضِ. From amongst His signs is showing you lightning. خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا. Because the thing about lightning is it's so powerful. It's a flash that it does cause fear. I mean, even when you hear thunder, it's very powerful. But it's Allah who does that. And this is also a rejection of the superstition that existed at that time. The Greeks believed that thunder was about the anger of God, which is, I mean, that's superstitious. This is that it's a sign of God, and what it does is, on the one hand, it shows you this power, but on the other hand, it's fear and hope. That's our relationship with Allah, is one of awe of His power, but also of hope, because we believe that ultimately that Allah is benevolent, that Allah is not antagonistic to our needs. He's in fact the facilitator of our needs. That is our ultimate relationship with Allah. But He's also has these attributes that are awe-inspiring and should cause concern. وَيُنَزِّلُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً. And this is what this whole thing is about. He brings from the heaven water, in other words, this dunya heaven of this world, because there are many meanings of heaven in the Quran. فَيُحْيِي بِهِ الْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا. And then He brings back the earth to life after it was dead. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. And in this is a sign for people who use their intellect. And then وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَن تَقُومَ السَّمَاءُ وَالْأَرْضُ بِأَمْرِهِ. And from His signs is that the heavens and the earth are maintained because of His command. That the whole maintenance of this thing is because Allah has commanded it. And Allah says, أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِي بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. Isn't it enough for you that Allah is witnessing this whole thing as a sign? That is very interesting, because Niels Bohr, the quantum physicist, said that nothing exists except if it's observed. I mean, that was his conclusion about the universe, that it had to be observed in order for it to really exist. And that is one of the signs that Allah says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We're going to continue to show them our signs in themselves and on the horizon, حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ, until it becomes clear that this is the truth. أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِي بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. Isn't it enough that He's witnessing the whole thing as a proof? Because the only way it could exist is by His mushahada. If you remove Allah's aynul inaya, the eye of providence, from existence, existence no longer exists. And so, from amongst His signs is that this whole thing is maintained because of this amr of Allah. ثُمَّ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ دَعْوَةً مِنَ الْأَرْضِ إِذًا أَنْتُمْ تَخْرُجُونَ. That إِذَا أَنْتُمْ تَخْرُجُونَ. Then if He calls you a calling from the earth, suddenly you're coming forth. So this is all about reviving. Now, how this relates, and I'll just talk briefly about this, how this relates to marriage. Marriage is one of the most important and foundational institutions in the world. And it's never been threatened in the way it's being threatened now. Every culture has an understanding of the sanctity of marriage. In primitive cultures, there are all of these taboos around relationships between individuals. And in more sophisticated cultures, the institution of marriage often enters into legal aspects because it deals with property and it deals with elements that are related to living in the city and living in a more complex type of culture. So in Islam, at the root of the Sharia are laws related to marriage. And that is why, if you look in a book of fiqh, the most extensive chapter in books of fiqh are marriage and divorce. The rules related to marriage and divorce are more diverse, and there are more elements involved in that than any other single section of the Sharia. And that is because that really is at the center of this whole matter. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, one of the things that he brought was a new arrangement, a new configuration involving male and female relations. And much of the past was in fact abrogated. In traditional Christianity, for instance, divorce was prohibited completely. And when the Prophet ﷺ introduced the idea in Islam of divorce, which is an abrogation of that prohibition, even though Reformed Christianity has allowed divorce. But in traditional Catholicism and in the first Christianity, you could not divorce your wife. It was a wife or a husband for life. And so the Prophet ﷺ came with new aspects. Another one was property division. I mean, that was another aspect. And inheritance laws. And the fact that traditionally prior to that in many cultures, women were inherited with property. These type of things. So in looking at this relationship, one of the things that I really see in the verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned is that there's a very profound and deep cosmology in this human relationship. And if we see the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that, I think it changes the experience of the relationship. Because not only are there signs in the male and the female, but also in children and in living together and in this constant recreation that's going on. The experience of being with another person in the world and growing with them, things dying in the past, things being reborn in the present, and then that process happening again and again. If we look at, the foundation of the Prophet ﷺ's teaching, it's really in honoring and cherishing not only the institution, but what's at the root of it, which is the protection of women and children. Because that really is at the root of marriage in Islam. And that is why the Sharia, I think if we look, and inshallah we will, at these rights and responsibilities, and then in how we can nurture our children in that, I think what you'll find is that the vast majority of the responsibility is on the male to honor the female. And I think that much of what's happened in the Muslim world, and I really believe this personally, much of what's happened in the Muslim world and the traumas that exist in the Muslim world relate to what's happening in the houses. I really believe that. And I feel that there's an immense amount of work that needs to be done in changing these basic relationships and in really honoring the sacred trust. Because this is one of the things in the final Hajj address. The Prophet ﷺ warned us about this trust. He said that you have been entrusted with your women. And he said, don't oppress them. And that was his final message. And one of the last things he said on his deathbed was, take care of your women. Because in order to humanize the world, our women have to be protected. They have to be in a space that process can happen. And if the space is not there, the security, the aman. And I think the loss of security in the world is only a reflection of the loss of security in the house. I think that a lot of what we're seeing outside is really a reflection of what's happening inside. Because in this country, if you look at so much of the troubled elements of modern society, I think you often find that it's rooted in very troubled homes. So I think there's an immense amount of work to do on ourselves, because I think about this a lot just with my own children, is just the fragility of their nature. Just looking at them with a mean glance can completely devastate them. And the thing is that we become hardened to those things. And that's one of the reasons why the Prophet ﷺ, he said, حُبِّبَ إِلَيَّ مِن دُنْيَاكُمْ ثَلَاث. I was made to love three things from the world, and one of them was an-nisa, which is women. And people should in no way think that that was any reference to sexual aspect, because it's just not. He said an-nisa, which is women. You know, Anjasha is one of my favorite hadiths. He was a young man who had a beautiful voice, and he used to sing for the camels. He was a cameleer, what they call hadi. And he was singing one night. They were in a caravan, and he was singing one night, and the women were in a tent nearby. And Anjasha's voice was so beautiful, the Prophet said, "Rifqan wayhaka ya Anjasha, qulub an-nas qawarir." And then in another one he said, "Rifqan bil qawarir." Go easy on these easily broken vessels. Because that's also part of the nature of the woman, is that her heart is more brittle. And that's something that the Prophet loved about women, was that it's easier for them. Because Allah is with the brokenhearted in the hadith. Inna Allah 'inda mukassarati qulubuhum. Allah is with the brokenhearted. One of the reasons that we're here is to get our hearts broken. Because until they're broken, there's no room, until they're emptied of all the stuff of this world. And that's part of the breaking. It's all to empty you of this madness. So I wanted to start that though with the Quran, because I just feel like we really need to start looking more as a community at the Quran and reconnecting with the Quran, because it's just either we're focused on very specific verses in which we justify our worldview, which is very easy to do with the Quran. You can kind of find everything. Everybody can find what they're looking for. The Quran says, "Alima kullu unasan mashrabuhum." Everybody knows what hole the watering hole they want to drink from. And the Quran will offer you that. But inshallah, if we take it in its totality, which means studying it holistically and trying to understand it as it explains itself to us, inshallah.
This completes CD number 2.
Inshallah.
This begins CD number 3.
The 31st chapter of the Quran is called Luqman, and it's a Meccan surah, which means that it was revealed during the first 13 years. So any Meccan chapter doesn't necessarily mean it was revealed in Mecca. It could have been revealed in Medina or in other parts of the peninsula. So when you say Meccan, it means it was prior to Hijrah. Alright, so this was prior to Hijrah, and it's important because the rules obviously change. Things change when the Prophet ﷺ moves from Mecca to Medina, and so it's one of the most important things about chapters and verses to know whether they're Meccan or whether they're Medinan or Mekki or Medini. Luqman, there's a different opinion about who he was, but some of the Mufassirun say that he was Aesop, who's known in the Western tradition for his fables, particularly about animals, Aesop's fables. And Aesop, it's something in this culture that you read your children, and they're actually very wise stories, and they usually have a moral at the end. So it'll say the moral of the story. Aesop would always tell the moral. And the idea of stories as being sources of morality is as ancient as humans have been telling stories, because the purpose of a story was always to have some type of moral resolution. And one of the things about modern stories is they don't have moral resolutions. So what you're dealing with is nihilism, which is the idea that there are no absolute values in the world, that everything's relative. So you'll have stories, modern stories, where the criminals are actually the heroes of the stories, and the criminals will actually be the ones that benefit at the end of the story. Traditionally, that was never acceptable. In melodrama, you had a resolution of good overcoming evil, and in tragedy, you had the idea of moral ambiguity, that a tragic hero had a flaw. Usually in Greek tradition, it was called hubris, which was overweening pride, and that hubris would cause that tragic hero to have a downfall. But there was always a moral, and the moral was that pride will destroy you. So if you look at, for instance, Shakespeare is constantly teaching in his tragedies ethics, but he teaches it through negative example. He shows you what doing bad will do, or what moral flaws, the effect that they'll have on your life. So the Quran says that we tell you the best stories, ahsan al-qasas, and the stories are always about those who stand with the truth and those who stand against the truth. And if you're standing for neither, then according to the Quranic worldview, you're basically against the truth, because you have to take a position in life. It's the nature of life. You have to take a position. You can't sit on the fence. That we're in an ethical world and there are choices, and the choice that you make is going to determine the outcome of your life, but also the outcome of your next life. And choice is centered in the heart. It's not necessarily an action. It can actually be a position that you take in your heart. So you might not actually have to do anything, but your heart has to be with the truth. And that is exemplified in people that are oppressed and have no power to change their condition, but they have a power to change how they respond to their conditions internally. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see wrong and you can't change it, you have to still reject it in your heart. And he said, and there's no faith after that you don't have any iman. So Luqman is one of the stories we're told in the Quran. Whether he was Aesop or not, it's not definitive, but that is one position. Some say he was a freed slave from Abyssinia. Some say that he was a king. I mean, there's different versions, but the important thing is that he was given wisdom, and that's what we're being told. It begins Alif Lam Mim, like the beginning of Baqarah, and the Huruf al-Muqatta'a, which is what they're called. These are letters that we don't know what they mean. That's always struck me as one of the most powerful proofs of the Quran, is the fact that it begins with phonemes that we don't know what they mean. Because I just think the idea of somebody thinking of that is so unusual, to begin a book with phoneme. And the point of beginning a book with phonemes is it's a rejection of the modern linguistic theory that all of language is based upon meaningless sounds. This is the modern linguistic theory that phonemes are meaningless, and they only become meaningful when coupled. So, for instance, da has no meaning, and has no meaning, and ga has no meaning. But if you say dog, it becomes meaningful. So the idea that the base of language is meaningless, well, this is in a sense a refutation of that, because what it's saying is these phonemes have meaning, but you don't know what they are. And there's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, a man was moaning, and there's some weakness in the chain, but the meaning is very profound, I think, in this light. A man was moaning, and one of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, said, "Stop moaning, kuf anka," the moaning. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Don't tell him to do that, because he's calling on a name from the names of God." So the idea of moaning when you're in pain, and that's one of the meanings of awah. In the Quran it says Ibrahim was awah. And the awah is somebody yata'awwah, that they have this moaning or this. So the idea that sounds are meaningful, that sounds are not meaningless. And that's a very interesting reason for the fact that several of the chapters of the Quran begin with these sounds that we don't know what they mean, but we know they have a meaning. Because it is impossible for Allah, or rather it is inconceivable that Allah would mention something put something in the Quran that was meaningless. We don't believe that. So it begins by Alif Lam Mim. Tilka ayatul kitab al-hakim. These are signs from a wise book. These are signs from a wise book. And ayat, we know that signs are in the self and on the horizon. In other words, there are signs outside of you and there are signs inside of you. And what the human being is he is a decoder of signs. That is why we are unique. Animals cannot decode signs. Human beings are capable of seeing symbols and understanding that they're symbolic of something else. So that is what is unique about the human being, is that we are decoders of signs. And every sign signifies something. And the ultimate sign is the universe. This is the big sign, is the universe. Well, what does it signify? The Muslims believe that it signifies that there's no God but Allah. And that's the lesson to be learned from all of these signs, is that this entire universe is alam. The word in Arabic for world is the same word that we get sign from, alam. So alam, the world, is something that is known. Now, who knows the world? Alim, the knower, which is what the human being is capable of doing, of becoming a knower, a Gnostic, somebody who has knowledge as opposed to ignorance. And then it says, Hudan wa rahma, Hudan, guidance, and mercy. And they go together because guidance is a mercy. Guidance is a mercy. This book has guidance in it. In other words, again, this is the idea of opposites, that you have error and deviation, and you have guidance, huda. And guidance and mercy go together, just as error and the opposite of mercy go together also. Because when you're in deviation, you're in a situation that is painful. And people that deviate other people, in a sense, are doing something that's very harmful to them, which is the opposite of what mercy is, because mercy is riqqa wa i'taf. It's something that occurs in the heart, which is a type of broken. Riqqa is something that indicates that the heart is soft and easily moved. And what mercy is, it's that element in the human being that moves him or her to help somebody else, to alleviate their suffering, to alleviate their struggling. And that's why the most powerful example of mercy is the mercy of a mother to a child. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, when he gave an example of God's mercy, he used the analogy of the mother and the child. And he said, once they saw a woman was breastfeeding her child, and the Prophet ﷺ said, do you see this child? And the companion said, yes. And he said, do you think she would throw her child into the fire? And they said, she would never do that. And then he said, Allah is more merciful to His servants than that mother with her child. So that's the analogy. Now, the other analogy he gave us was that God has 100 parts of mercy with Him, and only one He has sent down to the earth. The other 99 He retained in His presence. And that one, he said, is the mercy that from it a mare will not step on her foal. So even a horse, a female horse, a mare, will not put her foot on her foal out of mercy. That's a mercy. And she is inspired to do that. But that's from the mercy of God. So every mercy you see in the world is from the mercy of God. But you should know that all the mercy in the world, since the beginning of time till the end of time, is only one portion of 100 portions. And the other 99 have been reserved for the day of judgment. Right? And that's why Imam Busayri says, لَعَلَّ رَحْمَةَ رَبِّي حِينَ يَقْسِمُهَا تَأْتِي عَلَى حَسَبِ الْعِصْيَانِ فِي الْقِسَمِ. That perhaps the mercy of my Lord, when He distributes it in the next world, comes in accordance with the need of the wrongdoer for the mercy. So the more you need, the more is a portion to you. So it's a hudan wa rahma lil muhsinin, for the people who do good. The book benefits the people of ihsan. And ihsan are the people who are, the opposite of these people are the mufsidun, the people that sow corruption. The people of ihsan are the people that, the word literally means the beauty makers. I mean, if you took a literal meaning, hasuna means beautiful, ahsana means to make beautiful. But the idea there is that in aesthetic theory, beauty is harmony. Just as ugliness is disproportionate. In other words, the reason that we like things in proportion, even if you see a face, if you see a face in which there's been a stroke and half of the face is drooping, there's something troublesome looking at a face that's happened to. Because of the lack of proportion. It's the same if one eye is above the other. I mean, these things strike people, or a one-eyed person, or a one-handed person, because there's a loss of proportion. So beauty, in a sense, is the idea of harmony and proportion. And that is what the people of ihsan, they are maintaining balance in the world. They're the people that are keeping things in their proper proportions. So justice is about equal distribution. That's one type of justice. Right? There's other types of justice. But justice is about making sure everyone gets their due proportion. It might not be the same, but it's their due. And then he says, الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةِ, they establish prayer. And here you have alignment. Because the people who pray are aligned with the heavens. So there's an alignment there. Because what happens when you sever the alignment of the heavens and the earth, you get disruption in the world. That's the problem. When human beings are aligned with the heaven, there's order. And when they're not aligned with the heavens, there's disorder. And that is why the prayer that we do 5 times a day is in order to align ourselves with a higher order, which is the order of the cosmos. Because it's all in proportion and balance. And yuqimuna salat, the reason it doesn't say yusallun, those who pray, it says those who establish prayer, is because this is not about the outward form, it's about the inward reality. So people that pray the outward form are not necessarily muqimu salat. They're not establishing the prayer. They're praying, right? But they're not establishing the prayer. The people who establish the prayer are the people that are performing the prayer as it was intended to be performed. So it has to do with the reality of the prayer. وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ, and they give zakat. So here's the personal purification, which is your own soul, and then the social. That what you're doing is your own self is aligned with the heavens, but you're also making sure that what is around you is in order. And the way things get disorderly in human society is when there is economic inequities. I mean, that is the nature of oppression. Wherever you see people that are angry, it's rooted in economic injustice, generally. I mean, that's societal anger. There's other types of anger that have to do with different types of injustice. But out in the world, that's at the root of most people's anger, which is why when the Quran says, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ, don't devour your wealth amongst you in vain or unjustly. And then Allah says, إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَنْ تَرَاضٍ, unless that it is a type of commerce in which people are in mutual agreement about. In other words, both sides feel good about the transaction. Because when one side feels cheated, then you're setting the situation up for anger. And then it says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, and don't kill each other. In other words, if your commerce is not right, it's going to lead to wars. It's going to lead to economic wars. And if you look historically, most wars are about economics. Even if we look, I know that's a Marxian analysis, but even if we look at the Meccan, the main thing that really troubled the Meccans was their concern about the economic situation that they were in. They were really troubled by the idea of making the gods one, because they thought that if people didn't have gods, they wouldn't come to Mecca and they would lose their commerce. So it had to do with this concern about their economic condition. And then it says, وَهُمْ بِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ, and they have yaqeen, which is certainty about another world. Now, certainty comes from thought and perception. Certainty is not something that, because there are people that can be deluded and think they're certain about something, but that certainty can be shaken. Certainty is the unshakable. And there are 3 levels of certainty according to the Quran. There's ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen. And they're all mentioned in the Quran. The knowledge of certainty, the truth of certainty, the eye of certainty, and then the truth of certainty. Imam al-Ghazali, the example that he gives of these 3 levels of certainty is that the knowledge of certainty is that you've heard from a trustworthy source. That is a certain type of knowledge. So if you know Abdullah, and Abdullah comes to you and says, the mosque is on fire, and you say, really, did you see that? And he says, yes, I just came from there and it's definitely on fire. If you know Abdullah doesn't lie, you're going to believe that. And that's certainty. And then you'll go and say to somebody else, the mosque is on fire. They say, how do you know? Abdullah told me. And Abdullah doesn't lie. Well, that is the certainty that the Prophet ﷺ brought to the people that knew him. When he came, what did he say to the Quraysh? What would you say if I told you there was an army on the other side of this hill ready to attack you? And they said, we would believe you because you're the trustworthy. Then he said, what if I told you I was a messenger from God before the later days to give you news of paradise and a warning of the hellfire? And they didn't believe. So he used an analogy first. He's saying, look, you'll believe me in this. Will you believe me in this? Now, there's certain possibilities there. Delusion, a person can be deluded. A person can be a madman, right? Also, a person can be a charlatan. They might want something out of it. Now, we know that he was not a charlatan because he was offered to be their king, if he would give up that. He was offered that they would marry him the best women. He was offered wealth. All these things. They gave him everything in the world. And what did he say? If you put the sun in my right hand, if you put the moon in my left hand. In other words, if you gave me everything in the universe, not just in the world, but in the universe, I'm not going to stop telling people this message. There's no ulterior motive in this. And we know from Heraclius, he's called in history, Heraclius, who was the Roman emperor, when he asked Abu Sufyan, he asked him certain things, but one of them was, were any of his ancestors kings? And he said no. And the reason he asked that is because he wanted to know whether or not he was trying to regain some lost glory. And he also asked whether his followers were from the poor or from the rich. And when he said no, most of them from the poor, he said that's the way the prophets are. And he said, how was he before? Did you know him to tell lies before? And they said no, he never told any lies. In fact, he was called the trustworthy. So he said that he would not lie about God if he didn't lie about lesser things. So then it comes, was he mad? And the Quran says, مَا أَنْتَ بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ بِمَجْنُونَ. You're not, by the blessing of your Lord, you are not mad. Now the thing about mad people is the people around them will know that. I mean, madness is something, it's very difficult to conceal madness. And that's the nature of being mad. And so the fact that the people who were with him before, who were noted for their intelligence, people like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the fact that he was not only the first of the men to believe in him, but he stayed with him until the end of his life. So here's a man who grew up with him, who embraced his religion, and then after that stays with him as his closest companion. I mean, there's a sign for anybody of intellect to know. And even the Quraysh, when they said, what should we say about him? Should we say he's Majnoon? They said he's not. Laysa fihi al-jinnah. He doesn't have that type of madness that we see in mad people. See, they knew that they couldn't say that about him, so they didn't. They said, is he a poet? They knew they couldn't say that about him. So they said, this isn't poetry. We know what poetry is, and he's not. This isn't poetry. So what do we say about him? That all they could say was he was a sahir, he was a magician, because they saw the transformation of people around him. And magic is about transforming things. So they used this, that was the only thing they could say about him. Now, was he deluded? See, this is also another aspect to look at, delusional states. And I think if anybody studied his life fairly, that they would have to admit that he was not deluded. And the Quran also says that he did not have ghurur or delusion. Also